My name is Ellen Harris, and on behalf of the Office of the Arts at MIT, I am happy to welcome you to the Institute and to our conference, The Public Patron, Drafting a Mandate for a Federal Arts Agency. The conference is being presented by the Office of the Arts and was organized by Mark Palmgren, Director of the Council for the Arts at MIT. Before tonight's program actually begins, I would like to take this opportunity to outline briefly the schedule of events. First, we hope all of you here tonight are planning to attend tomorrow's panel discussions, which will also be held here at Kresge Auditorium beginning at 9:15 a.m. In the morning, the panel will present and discuss issues relating to the funding of creative expression. And then after a break for lunch, a second panel will discuss the role of a federal arts funding agency in terms of education in the arts, beginning at 1:30. Our panelists for both discussions comprise an outstanding roster of artists, educators, critics, and arts administrators from across the country, all of whom have faced these issues in their own work. At 4:15, following the panels, Representative Louise Slaughter, chairman of the Congressional Arts Caucus, will present the concluding keynote address, after which she will take questions from the audience. Registration for the day's events, including lunch, is $35, $25 for students with ID. If you haven't already registered, I invite you to do so following this evening's program or tomorrow morning here at Kresge starting at 8 a.m. This evening, Charles M. Vest, president of MIT, will welcome you, after which Senator Edward M. Kennedy and author and art critic Robert Hughes will present the opening keynote addresses. Mr. Hughes has kindly agreed to accept questions after his remarks. If you wish to ask a question, please step up to one of the floor microphones in the two center aisles. And when you are recognized, please identify yourself. I am sure that it will be appreciated by all of us if this time is used for questions only, and if you will keep your questions brief and to the point. I am pleased to announce that the Office of the Arts at MIT will be publishing the proceedings of the conference. The proceedings will be distributed to all conference registrants, key government officials, members and staff of the congressional committees involved in the NEA reauthorization and reappropriation hearings, and arts organizations across the country. MIT will also work towards developing an interdisciplinary policy paper to consider models for maintaining ongoing federal support for the arts and humanities, incorporating themes and insights from our deliberations here this weekend. And now I am pleased to introduce to you Charles M. Vest, president of MIT.
Thank you very much, Ellen. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to MIT and to this national conference on the roles and responsibilities of a federal art agency in the United States today. Now, some may see MIT, focused as it is on science and engineering, as a rather odd choice, a venue for such a conference. But as most of you already know, the arts are indeed a vital aspect of life here at the Institute. You need only look around at our outdoor sculptures, at our galleries, and when school is in session, at the multitude of courses and programs in music, theater, writing, photography, dance, and film that engage our faculty, our students, and our staff. One of the great things about MIT is that this is a hands-on place. We make things here, and much of our learning is through doing. I believe that that is one of the common denominators of artistic, technological, and scientific activity. And that is one of the reasons that the arts are indeed such a vital part of this institution. Much of what we do in these fields is overseen and coordinated by our Office for the Arts, which is sponsoring this conference. And a great deal of the support we receive for these programs comes from the Council of the Arts at MIT, a volunteer advocacy group of alumni, alumnae, and friends that was established over 20 years ago to foster the creative and performing arts here at the Institute. So clearly the arts are an integral part of what we are and what we do. But why is it important for scientists and engineers to study and participate in the creative arts? Quite simply, involvement in the arts broadens one's perspective and opens the mind to new possibilities. The arts spring from and concentrate on the human condition, our history, values, and cultures, the ways we find inspiration, the ways in which we identify and communicate ideas and emotions. And they help us to see the world in new ways. It's like looking at an image upside down, to see it for what it is and not for what our eyes are trained to see. When we develop our ability to think creatively, we are able to find new solutions to the problems on which we are working, both in our laboratories and in our lives. Creative activity is creative activity, whether it is the establishment of a new theorem in abstract mathematics, or the non-obvious optimization of a complex engineering process, or the expression of an artistic insight. Education in the arts, as in the sciences, helps us to develop and flex our creative muscle. It is rigorous exercise. It is good for us. One of our professors who wonderfully embodies both of these worlds is Alan Lightman, a physicist who heads our program in writing and humanistic studies. He is the author of the widely acclaimed novel Einstein's Dreams. And in a recent interview, Alan explained this duality of his interests this way. Human beings have this very rational, logical need to order our perception. But we also need to take away the fetters and fly free, escape from the physical world. We are both scientists and artists. It is a wonderful tension. We are whole people. We can't cut off one side of ourselves from the other. I cannot think of a better explanation for why the arts are essential to a complete education, even, or perhaps I should say especially, in a place like MIT. Science and mathematical literacy cannot be developed in the absence of general literacy. As Professor Ellen Harris, MIT's Associate Provost for the Arts, who you just met, has noted, the arts offer, and I quote her, a gateway to improving learning overall by enlarging the imagination, by instilling both discipline and wonder, and by teaching flexible and creative approaches to problem solving. In short, the sciences and the arts do and can inform and reinforce each other. So much for the role of the arts in education and the place of the arts at this institute. What about the role of the federal government as a patron of the arts? What are the principles to be followed and the goals to be achieved? That is what you are here to discuss and to debate, and if the gods are with us, perhaps even resolve. For my part, let me say that when it comes to the role of government in supporting any aspect of the academic enterprise, I believe that there is a fundamental principle, and that is that the free investigation of ideas, coupled with merit review by knowledgeable experts, is essential for maintaining the intellectual and artistic quality and integrity of work sponsored by outside agencies, whether they be the National Science Foundation or the National Endowment for the Arts. This is a principle that we have had some trouble sustaining over the past several years in our relationship with the federal government in many dimensions. Last year's controversy over the funding of the Corporal Politics exhibit at the List Center was but one case in point, and I do not want to dwell on that particular event because it is just a single example of the need to renew the partnership between our universities and our government, to rebuild a mutual commitment to investing in our long-term future through education, scholarship, and research. The time is ripe for rigorous and high-level examination of the federal government's complex role as a patron of the arts. This conference provides an excellent opportunity to work together to delineate the issues and articulate our expectations regarding the role of creative expression in our society and the role of arts in the education of our young people. I am delighted that all of you are here, and I certainly look forward eagerly to the results of your deliberations. Now it is my very great pleasure to introduce our two distinguished keynote speakers for this evening. You will hear first from Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts, who for 30 years as a member of the Senate has played a leading role in the affairs of our nation. He has been an eloquent spokesman for the less privileged in this country and for human rights internationally. He certainly has been a strong and effective advocate for higher education, for the advancement of research, and for the financial support of needy college students. He is legendary for his tireless and fruitful work on behalf of the causes he believes in. Senator Kennedy has chaired numerous key Senate committees and currently is chair of the Committee on Labor and Human Resources, which, among its many other duties, will oversee the upcoming reauthorization hearings for the National Endowment for the Arts. He will be followed by Robert Hughes, author and art critic who reaches 20 million people a week through his reviews in Time magazine. Mr. Hughes is the most widely read art critic writing today in the English language. He is also a best-selling historian and one of the most popular art lecturers in America. His most recent book, The Culture of Complaint, is a critique of American politics and culture and has received numerous enthusiastic reviews. I'm sure that his observations this evening will give us much to think about and to debate over the course of this meeting and beyond. First, then, may I introduce Senator Kennedy.
I want to say that that's a little better reception than I received the other day. I was down in the southern part of Virginia speaking, and someone was introducing me, and up got to some of the people in the audience and said, "Kennedy's a horse's tail," or words to that effect. And what happened, but some of the other people at the head table dragged this person out of the room, and I said, "Well, I didn't know this was Kennedy country," and they said, "It isn't, it's horse country." And I don't want to hear too much applause. I want to thank President Vest for his generous remarks, and he truly is an outstanding president for this outstanding institution, and I'm honored to be here with him today for this impressive conference. And I also want to commend Ellen Harris, Mark Palgrim, and the MIT Office of the Arts for convening this timely forum on public policy and the federal role in the arts. The arts are a central part of all of our lives, and support for the arts is an important principle of federalism that I strongly support. And it's part of our national responsibility to encourage a climate in this country that promotes development of the arts and encourages understanding and participation in music and literature and painting, sculpture and dance, and many other creative forms of expression. MIT is an ideal venue for this conference. This incomparable institution has produced some of the finest scientists and thinkers of our time. And it is no coincidence that MIT also has a long-standing policy that encourages training in the arts as a means to foster creative thinking and well-rounded human development. One of your distinguished professors has recently captured the wonderful blend of art and science as an inspired novel, Einstein's Dream. It is a warm and intimate portrait of that famous scientist, and I commend him for his achievement, Professor Alan Lightman. It is also a special honor to share this podium this evening with another brilliant writer who is also a noted critic. I had the honor of meeting him last year at the Kennedy School of Government, and it's a privilege to be with him now, Robert Hughes. As some of you know, or may know, I love to paint with mixed results. My artist friends have long advised me to stick to politics, and my Republican colleagues in the Senate are urging me to switch full-time to painting. The creative arts represent our common heritage and the universal need for positive expression. They simultaneously represent the most personal of our individual human feelings and the most universal, linking us to our common humanity. Some nations and leaders have attempted to censor expression they felt was excessive or seditious or merely inappropriate. But censorship has never silenced art for long in any land. And in a congressional hearing on the National Endowment for the Arts a few years ago, the great conductor Rostropovich spoke eloquently of the artists in his Russian homeland, who lived with censorship and sometimes lived in exile. Creative expression still endured, and great composers such as Shostakovich and Prokofiev composed wonderful works, but as Rostropovich sadly noted, their fellow citizens were never permitted by their government to share the joy of these masterpieces. It is remarkable and instructive that the leader who guided Czechoslovakia out of its dark years of oppression was a great writer and a visionary, Václav Havel. The soul of a nation cannot be extinguished by any censor. It is not only foolhardy, but futile for politicians to attempt to write guidelines for acceptable art. The arts defy orthodoxy or any other form of mediocrity. Regrettably, in recent years, the most public discussion of the arts in this country has been the debate over controversial work supported by the National Endowment. This debate misstates the mission of the endowment and insults its proud record of achievement over the past quarter century. It takes a very narrow-minded critic to see the molehill and miss the mountain. The Arts Endowment does not belong to any one person or political party. It reflects the national spirit and broad diversity in our country. It always has, and it always should. But the endowment is a fragile institution. It will survive only as long as the peer panel system, not political second-guessing system, determines which applications for support are funded. Artistic excellence, not political passion, must guide these decisions. Occasional mistakes should not become the pretext for destroying its noble mission or hamstringing its procedures. The great irony of this debate is that what Senator Jesse Helms and his Indecency Brigade want to do would Sovietize American art. As all of you know, the List Center became part of the national controversy when an application to support an MIT exhibition was rejected by the endowment. And to your credit and the endowment's discredit, the show went on, with private support replacing the federal support it deserved. Incredibly, the acting chairman of the endowment subverted her agency's own procedures. She ignored the recommendation of the National Council on the Arts and the peer review system, steps established by statute to avoid just this type of political intrusion into the endowment's deliberation. A national conference like this is an appropriate forum to state and restate some fundamental principles and avoid a repetition of distressing incidents like that. In a time of other urgent needs and few resources to meet them, some conclude that we cannot afford to support the arts, but that view is short-sighted. Federal support for the arts is an investment in the future that will bring important benefits to the quality of life in our communities. A recent national poll found that fully 92% of Americans say that the arts are important to the life of their neighborhoods, and they are also important to their economies. Ticket sales to performing arts events surpassed spectator sports by over $1 billion in 1989. In Charleston, South Carolina, the Spoleto USA Festival has brought $30 million a year to the city in the past 10 years. Yet in Massachusetts, the impact has been just as dramatic. From 1987 to 91, state and federal funds for the arts total almost $120 million and reached over 200 million people and 1.5 million artists. Federal support provides the essential seed money for broader state and local private aid. Nationwide, the federal investment is less than 70 cents a citizen a year. Arguably, it is one of the best investments the federal government can make. Our artists are also our most visible goodwill ambassadors abroad. Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, Agnes DeMille, and Martha Graham are quintessentially American artists, but their appeal is worldwide, and so too Ernest Hemingway, and Emily Dickinson, and William Faulkner are great American writers whose words reach out and touch the world. The appeal of our artists was dramatically demonstrated on Inauguration Day last January, when Maya Angelou recited her beautiful poem, celebrating the American national spirit and the sense of renewal that all of us felt that day. In her 1972 autobiography volume, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, returned to the bestseller list and has been there ever since. A miracle of marketing? No, a miracle of art. President Kennedy understood the importance of the arts. The Center for the Performing Arts that bears his name in Washington is a fitting living memorial to his vision. On its walls are carved his words which symbolize the hope he had for our country and his belief that we reach the highest when we reach deepest within ourselves. I am certain that after the dust of centuries has passed over our cities, we too will be remembered not for our victories or defeats in battle or in politics, but for our contribution to the human spirit. The arts chronicle our history, record our successes, warn of our weaknesses, expand our understanding. They challenge us not just to do better, but to do our best. Federal support to institutions and individuals must be accompanied by accountability like any other federal program, but federal support should not be conditioned or encumbered by restrictions that interfere with artistic freedom, any more than any federal aid to education should be used to interfere with academic freedom. In testimony before Congress, constitutional scholar Kathleen Sullivan warned against content restrictions on federal aid to the arts. We are each masters in our own homes. There we may pick and choose the ideas to which we open our doors or minds. But in the government's house, all ideas are welcome. Sometimes art shocks our sensibilities. It is supposed to. But that is no justification for unwarranted intrusions by extremists who, if the truth be known, oppose any federal aid to the arts. Obscenity is the place to draw the line. Federal dollars should not be spent on any project that is obscene. Current law explicitly prohibits funding for such projects. If funds are awarded for such purposes, they must be refunded. The proper way to determine obscenity is through the courts. A new round of contentious debate about these principles is on the horizon in Congress. The Senate must confirm a new head of the Arts Endowment, and we must pass new authorizing legislation for the agency. Congress will consider a 2-year extension of the endowment in the months ahead. This short-term action will permit the new administration to install a new team at the endowment and to participate fully in a comprehensive debate about these issues. By any fair accounting, the endowment has fulfilled its mission. It has done an exceptional job in providing support to the nation's cultural institutions, and it has dramatically increased the people's access to the arts. The challenge for both the administration and the Congress is to guide the endowment beyond the current criticism and controversy. The past administration was willing to be part of the problem rather than seek a fair solution. With the new administration, we have an excellent chance to restore confidence in the agency and provide a new sense of purpose for its mission. Now is not the time, nor I hope will there ever come a time, to turn our back on this essential public commitment to the arts and free expression. In closing, let me say again that it is an honor to be a part of this conference. I look forward to the results of your deliberation, and I'm grateful to you for including me in this important discussion. Thank you. You're up.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, when Mr. Clinton and the Democrats came to power in Washington a few months ago, there was a good deal of optimistic talk among the chattering classes, to which I belong, about the end of ideology in American politics. After the bruising divisions of the 80s, a time of healing characterized by something called a search for the center was supposed to be upon us. The alternative, which was set forth in a speech to the Republican convention in Houston by Pat Buchanan, the only man of my generation who ever made me feel, however briefly, ashamed to be Irish, well, the alternative was just too ugly to contemplate, that rhetoric of revenge, of cultural war. Remember that? Taking America back street by street from those who were not really Americans, such as blacks and homosexuals and liberals and atheists. Now, Bush had allowed his program to be written by the right wing of his own party, unfortunately, which staked everything upon the idea of a cultural and religious struggle. Winning it was going to return America to its original virtues, which had been in steady decline despite nearly 15 years of Republican rule since the New Deal. And once the Republicans had lost, many liberals hoped that these spectres of ideological intolerance would begin to retreat, baffled and defeated from the field of culture. Hadn't they tried to fight an election on cultural issues and lost? Wouldn't they conclude from this that America's overriding problem might indeed be the economy stupid and not the issues so richly symbolised in the various attacks upon the National Endowment for the Arts that were launched in the late 80s? Well, the short answer is no. There is no sign of an end to ideological division in America, and still less is there any sign of healing in the field of culture and the arts. In fact, the splits only seem to get wider and the shouting across them louder. Jesse Helms and his ilk spent a few months licking their wounds, but now, rest assured, they are licking their chops, and they will be back, and with reinforcements. What happened to the NEA in the late 80s was probably only a prelude to what is likely to happen in the immediate future and a few years down the road as the millennial year 2000 approaches. The morals of public funding is too hot and too handy a button to remain unpressed for long. Now, thus far, nobody has been appointed as the new director of the NEA, and we don't know who it's likely to be. Nor do I know what the President's cultural policies are in fact likely to be. I earnestly pray that we cannot deduce them from the inauguration festivities. Stage managed by a couple of sitcom producers and stuffed with Hollywood celebs, with the sole concession to high culture being a poem by Maya Angelou, on whose merits I disagree with Senator Kennedy. The most urgent one, however, it's the most urgent priority, it seems to me, ought to be defending the endowment. Well, one of the most urgent priorities ought to be defending the endowment against the pressures of both the right and the left in America. If there was ever a time when we needed to think clearly and openly about what the National Endowment for the Arts can and can't do, it is now. The NEA is an institution unique to America. It is also quite young. From the Declaration of Independence until the 1960s, there had been absolutely no tradition of federal support for the arts in this country, although there had been intermittent stabs at it. And where federal money and arts policy crossed, there were usually long delays and quite a lot of rancour and a tremendous amount of log rolling and the opening of many pork barrels. Controversy, for instance, over the monument to George Washington in the 19th century, which took something like 70 years to build, was as fierce as it was over Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial in the 20th. Traditional American laissez-faire left no room for federal arts subsidies. After all, why should it in a country that also rejected such novelties as public housing or healthcare or unemployment insurance? City money went to the construction of civic centres between 1900 and 1950, and there were significant tax exemptions for donors, for concert halls, for museums, but active funding of the arts from Washington was kept to the very bare minimum. As a result, what was performed, exhibited, and played in American institutions between the wars was largely Europe-dominated and Europe-driven. Now, as James Heilbrun and Charles Gray have pointed out in their book, The Economics of Art and Culture, which is due from Cambridge University Press, I believe, in August, and is the best introduction that I know to the labyrinth of the economics of American culture. This situation began to change in the 1950s, when the Ford Foundation began a program of grants for American symphony orchestras. But the big push for large-scale funding of the arts from state and federal governments started in the early 60s. At the state level, it began, as many of you will recall, when Governor Nelson Rockefeller set up the New York State Council on the Arts, whose funding was to peak in 1976 at $35 million a year. The idea of the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, was proposed in 1961 under John Kennedy by August Heckscher, and Lyndon Johnson pushed it through after Kennedy's assassination. The twin sister agencies, the NEA and the NEH, were written into law in 1965. And then, as now, these agencies were strongly opposed in Congress by Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans. There was in those days actually a group of people called conservative Republicans. There never has been a consensus on the need for national cultural endowments in America, and the arguments against them have scarcely changed in 50 years. They lead to government control of culture, which tastes of socialism, or else promotes mediocrity. They cost too much. Their worth can't be shown on a balance sheet. They reduce the virtues of private patronage. More recently, and this is argued from controversy over 5 or 6 grants among the tens of thousands made by the NEA in the last 30 years, they spread filth and immorality. Now, right from the start, the NEA was only interested in fostering the production of new works of art and in contemporary institutional practice. Matters of historical preservation, which are very much to the fore in the thinking of cultural agencies in European countries, were not within its purview, as they are, for instance, within the purview of the ministries of culture of France or Germany or Italy. The NEA's budget began in '65 at 10 million a year, and it reached its peak of effective spending power, which was 150 million in 1979. And though the nominal budget has gone as high as 180 million in the years since, when you figure in inflation, the present spending power of the NEA is somewhere around 40% below its actual value 15 years ago. It is about what one Japanese collector, a forest stripper called Mr. Saito, paid for 2 paintings, a Van Gogh and a Renoir, just before the art market crash in 1990. It is also less per capita, actually, than the money given in cultural support by the states. Now this, compared to other countries, was and is a tiny, a minuscule, a most parsimonious subsidy. A study done by Mark Schuster for the NEA in '85 showed that America was then giving $3 per capita to the arts in direct federal and state aid, as against $35 in Sweden, $32 in Canada and France, and so on down to $9.60 in Margaret Thatcher's Great Britain. However, this wasn't the whole story, of course, because none of these countries gave significant indirect support to the arts by allowing business or personal tax deductions for gifts. Factor those in, and American support went up to somewhere around about $13 per capita, above Great Britain, certainly, but still below all the rest. For there is a further component which wholly depends upon the NEA, which is the matching grant, by which the NEA puts its, as it were, has often been said, its good housekeeping seal of approval on a project by giving half the money and thus inducing another sponsor, corporate one or whatever, to pony up the rest. The NEA is now and always has functioned as a vital catalyst for non-government money for the arts. And there seems to me to be no convincing evidence that what conservatives claim, namely that private money would rush in to fill the gap if the NEA were to go out of business, is true or even remotely probable. For as a rule, corporate money likes prestige ventures, proven successes, wants to know in advance that it's going to be a Broadway hit, whereas it's essential to the NEA's mandate as it was conceived, and as I believe it should continue to go, to care for what is unproven, for what cannot yet succeed necessarily in the marketplace. You can contrast the position of the head of the NEA with that of Monsieur Jacques Toubeau, who is the new Ministère de Culture in France. Toubeau actually wanted he's a lawyer and he wanted the Ministry of Justice, but his wife has an interest in the arts, and so he settled for the Ministry of Culture, in which position he disposes of an annual budget of approximately $2 billion, 100 times the American equivalent, with which he can commission works of art for the state and restore Gothic churches and defend the purity of the French language, a prospect which I guess would give nightmares to anybody who tried the same thing in Washington today. to build opera houses and to underwrite the French film industry with the help of a tax of 17.5%, which is applied to every ticket to an American movie that's sold in France. And it is in this way that Arnold Schwarzenegger pays for Gérard Depardieu. He stands at the top of a pyramid of interlocking cultural interest which resembles the court of Louis XIV, except that it's much bigger, and has been magnified over the last 20 years by the requirements of François Mitterrand's and Jacques Lang's champagne socialism. A state-subsidized composer, official composer like Pierre Boulez, is, as a result, by far the most indulged and politically powerful man probably in the entire history of musical politics in France or anywhere else. To compare his influence to that, say, of Philip Glass or the late John Cage in America is like comparing ants and elephants. As Benjamin Disraeli observed, if you want to know what envy is, you must live among artists. And one remembers the words of a 19th century French Minister of Culture who, no doubt after a particularly trying day in the office, remarked that every time I award a commission, I create one ingrate and 30 malcontents. Such are the joys of patronage, but what would make even sponsorship wholly impractical, particularly on the NEA's tiny budget, is the conservative agenda, the agenda of some conservatives at least, of pre-vetting all grants for the moral content of their supposed results. Apart from the difficulty, as it were, the existential difficulty of censoring a work of art before it is actually made, modern democracy, I think, cannot contemplate without revulsion the machinery of supervision that this would entail. As a matter of fact, neither can many conservatives imagine it, which is why they say you should just get rid of the NEA. Better no sponsorship at all than the risk of blasphemy or buggery on government money. In fact, many conservatives seem to me to be caught in a sort of contradiction on cultural subsidies, half of them saying that the National Endowment should fold because it's elitist, and the other half claiming that in the end only high culture is worth having and that the NEA should go because it doesn't aim high enough. The taxpayers' money question is, of course, an extremely thorny one. The American right likes to brandish it as though it were completely unanswerable. And the difficulty for the left and the centre is that they have used it so often themselves against government spending that they don't like, such as military waste. If your sense of frugality is offended by the famous $1,000 ratchet wrench or the $600 toilet seat in a bomber, why shouldn't someone else raise a hue and cry about 40 grand's worth of NEA money going to subsidise a photography show that includes a picture of the artist with a bullwhip up his butt? Well, it is true that the money wasn't very much in the scheme of American budgets. It represented about 1/40th of 1% of 1 copper penny for every man, woman and child in this democracy. Nevertheless, as was frequently pointed out, it was public money all the same, and the point made by Jesse Helms and Donald Wildman and their ilk was that no sum, however small, ought to be spent by government on the dissemination of images or ideas that some part of the tax-paying public might find morally repulsive. Therefore, let these artists do their stuff, as the saying went, on their own time and on their own dime, and never mind that neither Mapplethorpe nor Serrano actually received a cent of government money themselves from making their disputed images. In other words, to qualify for government support through the NEA, a work of art had to satisfy what these people imagined to be a moral consensus. It had to be, in essence, incapable of offending anybody, no matter how low his or her threshold of offence might actually be. Now, the obvious problem is that in a society containing something like 260 million people, there is probably no such work of art, not even a nude by Renoir or a naked baby Jesus by Andrea della Robbia. The insolubility of the problem appears if you reflect upon the amendment which Jesse Helms and Al D'Amato and Orrin Hatch, those three musketeers of morality, tried to read into law. The Helms Agreement proposed that no government fund should be given by the NEA to, quote, promote, disseminate or produce in its exact words, 1. Obscene or indecent materials including, but not limited to, depictions of sadomasochism, homoeroticism, the exploitation of children or individuals engaged in sex acts, or 2. Material which denigrates the objects or beliefs of the adherents of a particular religion or non-religion, or 3. Material which denigrates, debases, or reviles a person, group, or class of citizens on the basis of race, creed, sex, handicap, age, or national origin, unquote. Now, the most obvious and curious feature of the Helms Amendment was that if it had not issued from the lips of a famously right-wing Republican senator, you could have mistaken it, and especially clauses 2 and 3, for any ruling on campus speech limitations recently proposed by those other self-appointed censors who are cutting loose in our harried society, those hypocritical pests of academe, the politically correct. It was hard to know exactly what Helms meant by a particular religion or non-religion. Pantheism, I don't know. But certainly Clause 3 made it clear that he was against racism, sexism, ableism, lookism, and any of the other offences against social etiquette whose proscription by PC was already causing such mirth and laughter among old conservatives off campus and creating not a few new ones on it. And thus extremes tend to meet. In fact, the Helms Agreement was so broadly drafted as to be virtually meaningless. Its effect would have been to create a kind of loony parody of cultural democracy in which every citizen became his or her own Cato the censor. All that a work of art would need to be defunded, or if shown in a museum under NEA auspices removed from view, would be to offend anybody for practically any reason at all. The amendment was thus a sort of crystallisation in very pure form of our present culture of complaint into law. It would have made the National Endowment hostage to every crank, ideologue and god-botherer in America. A grant for the exhibition of, say, Gothic ivories could be pulled on the grounds that the material was objectionable to Jews, since much medieval art is deeply anti-Semitic, or to Muslims, because, who knows, one of those ivories might have contained a not uncommon figure of false prophets boiling in hell with Muhammad, which was quite a favourite in the Middle Ages, or, for that matter, to atheists offended by the use of government money to insert any sort of religious propaganda, including ancient ivory carvings, into a museum. And indeed, one could imagine some Stalinist feminist complaining that a 13th century depiction of a patriarchal god, or the sexism implicit in a subservient or tempting Eve, was repugnant to her religion or non-religion. Under the Helms Amendment, a fire worshipper might well claim that the presence of extinguishers in the museum was repulsive to his deity. Now, Helms and his supporters were, of course, at pains to deny that the amendment had anything at all to do with censorship. Nevertheless, one would have needed to be remarkably naive to suppose that censorship was not the root of this controversy. The efforts to cut off government money from offensive art were but the tip of a general effort growing on the right to repress all offensive art, subsidised or not, under the assumption, basically, of their proponents that the stuff isn't a necessary part of social discourse anyway. The wisest analysis of this problem was offered some months later by a Jesuit, the Reverend Timothy Healy, the director of the New York Public Library, now alas dead. The debate is about censorship, Father Healy declared to a House subcommittee on post-secondary education in November 1989, and he went on, against the argument that the artist is free to write, to paint, or to compose as he pleases without federal subsidy, we must urge that to deprive an artist of that subsidy because of the content of his work is a clear and strong kind of censorship. The counter-argument is really a dodge. The mixing up of the realm of law with the realm of morals is deadly. Law can tolerate evils that morality condemns. We have a good law if it can be obeyed, if it is enforceable, and if it is so prudently drafted that it avoids most of the harmful effects that flow from it. If a law does none of these things, it is a bad law, no matter what the logic or the moral intensity behind it," unquote. Though none of the arguments heard on the Senate floor attained the clarity and sophistication of this priest's words, the Helms Amendment was voted down. But its defeat did not dispel the idea that the US government implicitly puts its moral weight behind all the art that it funds, that the artist with an NEA grant becomes, as it were, the voice of the state, and that the state is therefore to be held responsible for what he or she makes or says. The NEA, however, was never conceived as an arm of state propaganda, except in the very general sense that Kennedy, Johnson, and their advisers felt that America should support its own artists and would, in some general way, look better for doing so. There is a huge difference between commissioning a work of art and sponsoring a talent. The patron says, when he is commissioning something, "I want a mural with me on horseback showing democracy trampling on ignorance, and moreover, after that, I want to own the mural." The NEA essentially puts a bet on talent at arm's length through the peer review system, and then it gets out of the way. Once you forget the difference between state commissioning and this kind of sponsorship, every attack upon the NEA becomes possible. I mean, this was the confusion behind the culture wars equivalent of the Willie Horton ad. Pat Buchanan's noted TV spot attacking George Bush through the NEA and PBS. So many of you must have seen this one. You saw clips from a documentary that had been made for PBS about gays. The clips were leather queens capering in the street in the course of a march. And over this appalling saturnalia, there came the voice of a narrator saying that this is what George Bush was investing your tax dollars in. Note the use of the verb, investing in half-naked gays, the way that his father used to invest in oil wells. Here was Bush putting your money into a kind of wildcat scheme for the propagation of homosexuality. But actually, that isn't the way it works. The idea behind the NEA fundamentally is that a democracy can subsidize a forum, an agora, a marketplace of ideas and images without specifying in advance what kind of images and ideas should be displayed in it. This certainly relies upon some kind of an agreement of common interest between the sponsor and the artist. But there are plenty of precedents for it, and there are plenty of working parallels to it in American life already. When, for instance, a university gets federal, state, or city funds, they come with the assumption that the place will remain free from ideological pressure and that any issue can be reasonably exposed and debated on campus. If this isn't so, the university, state subsidized, wholly or partially, cannot function as a place of teaching and learning. The fact that public money is involved does not mean that the university should avoid or skirt controversial ideas or punish people for uttering them. The university has to stick to that, no matter how inconvenient it may be, and it sometimes is extremely inconvenient. For example, I and many other people regard Leonard Jeffries as an anti-Semitic madman whose scholarship is farcical. But you cannot get rid of him now by saying that the views that he teaches are offensive to most Americans, blacks included, and that since CCNY gets dollars from the taxpayer, he should for that reason be forced out. On an even more basic level, this city, like any other in America, has parks and squares and streets which are maintained by public funds. And yet it is perfectly legal to express your views in them, however repugnant those views may be to others. That is a basic part of citizens' rights under the First Amendment. If I want to demonstrate for or against abortion in that state-sponsored civic space, I can. If I want to propose voting rights for insects, or urge the immediate repatriation of all Catholics from Boston to Ireland, I can do that too. I may not succeed, but I can do it. The assumption behind this, and behind the NEA too, is that diversity in a democracy is good. We agree to pool our tax dollars to create a general frame in which opinions can be freely uttered and images freely propagated. Any opinions, however much they may annoy or offend somebody else who also has the right to express his or her opinions, no matter how repugnant I might find them. Does this mean that the NEA is obliged to subsidise any and every kind of utterance without aesthetic, moral, political or other distinctions or considerations? I don't believe so. No sponsor, still less patron, in the history of art has ever done this. But it does mean that the NEA has to be prepared to resist unreasonable pressure, not only from the moralists and censors of the fundamentalist right with their cant about family values, but also from the censorious left with its consistent betrayal of the liberal ideal that high cultural standards can be popularly accepted and practiced. It has got to shift its attention away from the cliches of our time, the chatter about empowerment, the obsession with resentment as a cultural standard. There is a right jaw of the vice and there is a left one, and between the two, the NEA is painfully squeezed and may in the end be distorted out of useful shape. These pressures are the outcome both of the PC belief that the personal is the political, acts of imagination not exempted, and of the conservative view that any stick you can beat liberals with is a good stick, and never mind what else gets flattened in the struggle. The National Endowment for the Arts was not in fact designed to be an arena for such disputes, and thus it proved extraordinarily awkward and even inept at responding to them, and its response is complicated by the claims of activist art to constitute an avant-garde. The population of the art world expanded enormously in the 1980s, and in an overpopulated art world with a depressed market, you are going to hear more and more about discrimination against artists, endless complaints about racism, sexism, and so on, whereas the fundamental and underlying problem is that there are too many artists of all kinds in America for the base of collectors and sponsors to support. That is why the National Endowment for the Arts really matters in the ecology of American culture. But it cannot do good work, in my opinion, if it caves into the false politics of group entitlement. The sense of disenfranchisement among artists has led to a stream of attacks upon the idea of quality as though it were the enemy of justice. Quality, the argument goes, is a plot. It is the result of a conspiracy to marginalise the work of other races, other cultures by, the pale patriarchal penis people. And to invoke its presence in works of art is somehow inherently repressive. This drivel has become the new orthodoxy, and fewer critics and historians seem able to resist it. More and more, it is assumed that one's cultural reach is fixed and determined forever by whatever slot one is raised in. You can imagine the contempt with which a great Mexican artist like Diego Rivera would have reacted to this. Rivera probably gave more to Mexico in terms of self-knowledge and cultural pride than any artist whose name we know in its entire history, but he was only able to do so because he had absorbed and completely internalized the great tradition of Renaissance fresco painting, which combined with his absorption in French modernism, pre-Columbian Mexican art, and living folk art to produce the tremendous results that we see on such walls as those of Palacio Nacional in Mexico City. If you had told Rivera that quality didn't matter, he would have laughed in your face. Now, you can't deny that at any time in the history of art there have been inflated reputations and wrongly ignored artists. Certainly this is as true today as it ever was. This happens in the short term, but in the long run the injustices do tend to be corrected. There remains, for instance, practically no institutional bias against women artists in America any more than there is a bias against women writers in American publishing. And this is certainly very different to the America that I first came to in 1970. And yet, you have to bear in mind that not all artists are wrongly ignored. Mediocrity is the natural fate of most creative endeavour, especially in a society which, in the name of therapeutics and personal growth, has removed most of the rigour from the training of its artists. Most art made by white Americans is mediocre. Most art made by black Americans is mediocre. Most art made by Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and American Indians is mediocre too. And most art made by women is as mediocre as most art made by men. The same applies to gays and straights and to all the other polarities. We must therefore be extremely wary of the sentimentality that institutional multiculti breeds. Those who talk about remedial multiculturalism as a radical program, and as anybody who has read my book will know, I am very much a friend of multiculturalism, and I am totally in favour of it. Otherwise, I would never have left my own country to begin with in order to start trying to see through the scrims that divide us and understand other people's image banks. But this is not what is meant so often by multiculturalism in this society. What is meant so often is a sort of separatism. Anyway, those who talk about remedial multiculti as a radical program fail to see how conventionalising and soothing and altogether consoling to middle-brow taste its effects can tend to be. One already sees this in one area, that of publicly funded art, where multicultural programs serve to get the embattled National Endowment for the Arts off the hook of making any discriminations at all. If the Philistines are baying for an end to government support for high art, for difficult and possibly controversial art, and if meanwhile the moralists are yelling for the blood of any poet or performer whose work might raise hackles in some golf club in Tulsa, then what could be a better refuge than multiculturalism? Just turn the already meagre trickle of government money towards stuff that nobody could quarrel with, areas such as, to quote from a recent brochure issued by the NEA's last director, Anne Imelda Radici, quote, Hmong needlework, coastal seagrass basketry, Southeast Alaska native dance, American Indian basketry and woodcraft, Pacific Island canoe building, and Appalachian banjo playing. This sentimental form of cultural diversity, as interpreted by federal funding agencies and an increasing number of private foundations, may or may not pick some good stuff out of the woodpile, but most of the time it entails pious gestures of cultural support while actually producing remarkably little that would, in aesthetic terms, challenge, refine, criticise, or in any way extend the thinking of the status quo. Under the rubric of self-esteem, they foster mediocre art for a populist mentality that contents itself with relatively easy tasks expressed in the jargon of supporting ethnicity and gender differences in the arts, instead of the harder one of looking for real excellence. Too much of the art that results from such programs turns out to be affirmative, prolix kitsch, gushing with sincerity, and people like it for the same reasons that they like Hallmark cards with Sumier herons and New Age verses on them. It just makes them feel good. Now, you can certainly run a feel-good cultural program on sociological and statistical criteria, backing it up with the usual pieties about empowerment. And this conforms very well to the evangelical tradition of American cultural life, the idea that one is morally improved, uplifted, and turned into a better citizen by producing or consuming art. But the art that it fosters may be, and sometimes is, quite banal. What happens where government arts money and populist multiculturalism intersect? All too often a form of moral blackmail with one eye on the pork barrel. Now, in Holland for the last 20 years, they tried a form of populist pork for everybody. The government set up a fund to buy work by artists, no matter how good it was. All that mattered was that the artist should be A, alive, and B, Dutch. About 8,000 Dutch artists are represented in that collection. None of it is shown, and as everybody in Holland, including most of the artists involved, I fear, now admits, about 98% of it is rubbish. The storage expenses are so high that they have to get rid of the stuff, but they can't because nobody wants it. They tried giving it to public institutions like lunatic asylums and hospitals. But even the lunatic asylums insisted upon standards. They wanted to pick and choose. So there it all sits. Democratic, non-hierarchical, non-elitist, non-sexist, unsaleable, and, to the great regret of the Dutch authorities, only partially biodegradable. Now, there are lessons from this, and let me suggest two of them. The first is that if Dutch madhouses can discriminate about art without being accused of anti-democratic elitism, so can the NEA. But mind you, I speak as an unrepentant elitist. I don't think democracy is any guide to taste. I think the job of democracy in the field of art is to make the world safe for elitism. Not an elitism based upon race or money or social position, but on skill and imagination. And the embodiment of high ability and intense vision is basically the only thing that does make art popular. It is why the Rijksmuseum is full of people and the remedial art basements of Amsterdam are not. The greatest popular spectacles in America are elitist to the core: football games, basketball games, professional tennis. But nobody is going to pay to watch Hilton Kramer and me swim the 800-metre freestyle in 35 minutes flat, despite our relatively privileged position as white European males. Like sport, art is an area in which elitism can display itself at a negligible cost in social harm. The second lesson is that if a scrupulous participatory democracy like Holland spends 25 times per taxpayer what America does on culture, choosing art on sociological grounds in the name of complete cultural egalitarianism, and then ends up with a garbage disposal problem, what guarantee is there that we can do much better here? Absolutely no guarantee that I can see. It is in the nature of human beings to discriminate. We make choices and judgments every day. These choices are part of real experience. They are influenced by others, of course, but they are not fundamentally the result of a passive reaction to authority. And we know, I think, that one of the realest experiences in cultural life is that of a certain inequality between books and musical performances and paintings and other works of art. Some things do strike us as better than others, aesthetically better, more articulate, more radiant with consciousness. We may have difficulty saying why, but the experience remains, and aesthetic discrimination must not be tarred with the brush of racial or gender discrimination. It corresponds to experience, just as our perception and comparison of grace in the work of a basketball player or a tennis pro rises from experience, and these differences of intensity and meaning and grace can't be set forth in a little catechism or a recipe book. They can only be experienced and argued and then seen in relation to a history that, of course, must include social history. Now, the NEA, as I understand it, was founded in order to identify, to pick out those sparks in the cultural campfire around which we all sit, wherever they may be found, to fan them, to give them oxygen, to bring them into flame. This is the way that sponsorship makes its modest bets about the future. The moment you go to other criteria, you may be in trouble. If you reform your program in terms of agendas based on the artist's race or gender or supposed degree of cultural enfranchisement, if you start agonizing, for instance, about whether the quota of grants to Hispanic activist video artists has been fulfilled, you will have no answer to the Conservatives, who then turn around and want to know why the NEA isn't giving equal grants to Christian fundamentalist poster designers. I am certainly an elitist in that I believe in high aesthetic standards, and I think the NEA should too. I'm also a populist in that I believe that these standards can and do make sense to people who are prepared to pay enough attention. The surest way to convert the NEA into a dead letter is to make its sponsorship an area for battles, many of which do indeed need to be fought, but fought in the sphere of politics. The trouble with fighting political battles on cultural turf is twofold. First, as many of us will recall from the 1960s, they are rarely won there. And secondly, in the process, you may simply kill the grass so that everybody loses. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Yes, please come down to the microphone so we can hear you. Tell us who you are.
My name is Williams, and I live here in Cambridge. Two questions in response to your talk. One is you got into it a bit about the question of elitism. In a discussion the other night with someone I consider to be a very good artist, he described the Boston Symphony as basically preserving music that was once performed for kings for today's equivalent, only it's subsidized by, there's a subsidy for the wealthy people, primarily so they can go and enjoy this music. And so I wonder if you could speak to not whether it is good or worthy, but whether it should be subsidized, maybe it should be paid for by the people who are enjoying it.
Who is it that supposes that the audience of the Boston Symphony consists exclusively of the wealthy?
Right, no, I understand that. I don't think it is.
I mean,
exclusively. And they do have $6 rush tickets, and that was part of our discussion.
Yes, well, it doesn't seem to me that you need to be an unusually wealthy person to afford a ticket to the Boston Symphony. I would have thought that your acquaintance could have better phrased it by saying that they were taking music which, some of which at any rate, you know, it's not true that all the music that the Boston Symphony performs or any other symphony performs was actually written at the behest of kings, but some of which, let's say for the sake of argument, was performed by kings, and recycling it back to people who were not kings, in other words, recycling it back to the citizens of a democracy, rich and poor. I mean, the idea that it seems to me profoundly condescending to suppose that the only people who are interested in what is for convenience called high culture are the rich. It is not true. And if it were true, every music hall, every symphony hall in America would have closed long ago. If classical music didn't have some kind of popular base, it couldn't survive.
The other question I wanted to ask about was, in my experience in Cambridge with Cambridge has an Arts Council, this is another criticism that is levied against the problems of funding of the arts, is that the sense that, at least on a local level, maybe not as much on the national level, that it becomes a kind of arts bureaucracy or a group of arts bureaucrats, not artists, who have a regular staple of favorites that they fund year after year who aren't in fact excellent as you would.
Well, I think there's probably a good deal of merit to that criticism. There is always, in any, one of the great problems of setting up arts funding systems is to avoid losses by log rolling, by favoritism, by back scratching, and simply by bureaucratic friction. And I think one of the inherent problems of the NEA peer review system is that you get chaps and chapesses scratching one another's back. But when you think of the alternative to it, or the various alternatives to it, I think probably there is still quite a lot to be said for the peer review system. But the idea that, alas, we do not live, in a utopian world, and it has never been possible to devise, I think probably not since the time that Og and Mog first did their first buffalo on the Aurignacian caves, it has not been possible to devise a system of arts funding that totally eliminated favoritism and log rolling, alas. But the question is, because of that, because arts funding does not represent the sort of mechanisms of of an ideal cultural world, do you therefore dispense with it? I mean, I shudder to think of the number of really rather mediocre works of art that that have been commissioned, that were commissioned in France through the 19th century. Quite a few, and endless protests from artists and complaints from artists about the laxity, the blindness, the deafness, the general unresponsiveness of cultural bureaucrats. I mean, you read the journals of Hector Berlioz, for instance, and one sees it at full stretch. Nevertheless, on the balance, I think one is grateful in the end that there was some kind of system set up for the public encouragement of the arts. on the results.
I just wondered what your thoughts were about the idea of artists suing the NEA. This happened recently with a number of artists, performance artists in particular.
Well, it's America, everybody sues everybody else. This is the most litigious society that's ever existed, I think. I have not, I have to tell you quite honestly, I haven't closely followed the ins and outs of the case that was brought, I think by Karen Finley and Holly Hughes and others against the NEA. I mean, my first reaction was, oh, come on, give me a break, you know. It revolves around the question of whether active censorship did indeed take place, and I think the court concluded that it did so. But I'm afraid that I haven't, you know, I mean, rather to my shame, I've not followed that, I've not given that the attention that I should have, because I was working on a book, and so consequently, I'm sorry to cop out like this. I really do feel that, you know, it is hard to talk about people's entitlements to a grant. Nobody is entitled to a government grant. I think this is a spin-off from an excessive kind of caricatured sense of entitlement that runs through America at the moment.
Could you tell us who you are?
My name is Larry Bolton. I'm from Prague.
Thank you.
My name is Liam Rector. I'm covering this for the Harvard Review, and I teach at Bennington College. I'm assuming, Mr. Hughes, that you must have read John Frohnmeyer's book, Getting Out of Town Alive.
Yes, I did.
It's, in my view, a pitiful book.
Yes, in my view
I'd
too.
like to know your thoughts on the book itself, one, and two, I'd like to know what sort you think would be a good NEA director, both in general and some specific examples you might have.
Oh, well.
Somebody would lead the NEA for a change.
Obviously, you need a woman with the reach of a gorilla and the balls of a brass kangaroo. Frohnmeyer fulfilled none of these requirements. I mean, Frohnmeyer is a very nice bloke. You know, he hasn't got a mean bone in his body. That's why his tenure at the NEA was was so bedeviled. In order to resist the kind of political opportunism that is thumping upon I mean, you know, there are various grounds for criticising the NEA, which range from, shall we say, at least an intelligent conservative view of the matter, to, you know, this kind of lumpen opportunism which we see from, you know, the right Republicans, who are just basically grandstanding and don't give a damn about what you know, the cultural health of this country might or might not be. And in order to resist this, one needs an extraordinary amount. You just need to be extremely tough. Frohnmeyer wasn't tough, nor do I believe that he had his fundamental cultural priorities in the right place. He came into there not quite knowing what he thought, brandishing his little cello or whatever the hell it was he plays. And no, there are no little cellos, I'm sorry. And he was like a fish out of water. And the subtitle of his book, what was it? Memoirs or Confessions of an Arts Warrior, you know, which suggests some brave fellow going forth with his magic sword to conquer the Mordor of Washington. Well, of course, it's hokum. You know, he was the wrong, you know, he was the wrong guy in the wrong place. Just as I would say Anne Imelda Radici was the wrong person in the wrong place. And anybody who goes into running the NEA on the terms which were dictated for Radici is also going to be the wrong person in the wrong place. Because if you have a supposedly independent system of arts funding, which then becomes buffeted around in the winds of whatever the electoral requirements at the moment might be, as the NEA was, as you know, during Frohnmeyer's and Radici's tenure, then, you know, the institution is not well served by those who run it. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
My name is Sam Walker, and I'm with the Christian Science Monitor. And my question is, in an age of extreme pressure to reduce government spending, what would your strongest argument be to the Appropriations Committee to either maintain or increase funding for the NEA?
I think it would be rather difficult to make the argument for increasing its funding fly, although I do actually believe that given its, the NEA would probably, might even do better if it had more money at its disposal. The argument that I would make is a very straightforward one. Really it is that some degree of government support for art, for works of art, be they concerts or theatre or whatever, or performance of any kind, or paintings or sculpture, is actually necessary in a society where not everything that is good can depend automatically upon private or corporate institutional support. The second argument is that the main function of the NEA, as I see it, is to act as a catalyst towards institutional support for genuinely informative and useful kinds of cultural, I hate the word cultural programming, it sounds Stalinist, cultural events, the sustenance of museums, the sustenance of symphony orchestras and so forth, which actually, after the over-optimistic projections made in the 80s about how everything could be taken, all this kind of support could be taken up by the private sector, it has been fairly well shown that actually it's not so easy for the private sector to come in fearlessly and do it. It needs a certain amount of encouragement. It needs to be led by the nose. The NEA has always had a very important function in this relationship. I would defend the NEA primarily as catalyst and only in the second place as patron. And I would say to people who are calling for a diminishment of its funds that these funds are already cut to the bone. They are, by comparison to other great democratic states in Europe, almost ludicrously low, and that that their present expenditure does not involve any serious drainage from other vital parts of national interest. So why not keep it going?
If I could follow up, there have been some arguments that in order to be a catalyst, the NEA doesn't necessarily have to send any money. The stamp of approval from the NEA doesn't necessarily constitute spending. How would you respond to that?
Oh, I think there's no sign of commitment quite like a check. Voids is cheap. Yes.
My name is Roger Kahn. I'm a professor and I'm the director of the Center for Nonprofit Organization Leadership at Regis University in Denver and the program chairman of a forthcoming conference on arts, culture, and community, public funding, and social responsibility. Your comments on the Dutch experience and your observation that the role of democracy in the arts is to make the world safe for elitism make me wonder what you in fact think with the NEA and other public funding sources are suitable for criteria for supporting public arts.
Whether I think they have suitable criteria.
Not whether you do think they have, but what you think they might be.
One is often asked about what criteria should be assumed by the NEA, as if there were a kind of yardstick which that august institution could pull out of its pocket and lay alongside a work of art. Basically what the NEA does, and what I think it should do, is make the kind of educated guesses about sensibility and its action about creative sensibility that you or I might make as, sort of literate observers of whatever art we like. And then go ahead and do it on that basis. In other words, I tried earlier in the speech to outline very strongly, to argue very strongly that in the first place, the NEA should be looking for some sort of genuine and arguable excellence in hopefully in the results that it subsidizes. But that excellence can only be argued in the presence of the work of art. This is one of the big problems with funding things before they actually take place. You see the results afterwards, and it may, work or not. But basically what they should be doing is looking for serious talent within the field that they wish to subsidise and going on whatever aesthetic criteria they believe to be proper and which can be argued, and I believe these should be argued.
If I can push that for just 1 second, it seems to me that if Picasso were reincarnated, we might find that he would be worthy of support because of his prior record. And
yes, we know that he's Picasso.
And what you're saying. And in the context of a pluralistic democracy where there are so many people that we are not familiar with and so many groups with which we are not familiar, are there any standards that you can think of or criteria that you can articulate that would help us in the deliberative process of figuring out what it is that we want to be supporting with public monies?
You go for the work of art, you go for the person or the group's past record, you look as attentively as you can at what that person or group has done, you try to figure out, therefore, on that basis, whether that talent has the kind of coherence and, adventurousness of spirit and, sort of intelligence of results that one is looking for in a work of art. It is hard, as I say, it is hard to sort of invent a verbal 3-foot rule which you can then lay alongside a play or a painting in advance and say, okay, this measures up to it, this doesn't. One's understanding of a work of art is essentially an existential matter. It happens, in the presence of the work. You get some sort of a visceral reaction, and it's that, it's the ability of the thing to, I suppose, spark that promotes the faith in the the small act of faith in the artist. That, in other words, it is a subjective judgment. You cannot escape subjective judgments by multiplying subjectivities in the form of a committee. It still ends up as a subjective judgment, and it has to be pursued as such. How do you do?
Saying that issues of multiculturalism should not be played out in the National Endowment for the Arts.
No, I didn't say issues of multiculturalism shouldn't be. I said issues of group entitlement shouldn't be. There's a very important distinction.
Well, then I'm curious, what do you think cultural institutions should be doing about this?
They should be encouraging talent.
Demographics that we all know about.
They should be encouraging talent, and talent is not necessarily a function of demographics. They should be looking as widely as they possibly can across the demographic spectrum. That goes without saying. But in the last analysis, when it comes down to what you're going to fund, you fund it on the basis of what you think is good, the work, I mean. They shouldn't be having quotas for blacks or gays or women or whites or whatever. There should be no such quotas, in my opinion, no. But there should be a very definite openness to all those groups and to all sectors of society, and there should be a profound curiosity about what they're doing, and then, at the end of the day, you've still got to make your judgment on the basis of whether you think there's real talent there or not.
This gentleman, I think, was trying to get at questions of standards. Do you think standards differ from community to community? And then one might want to look into the community itself?
Well, it depends on what you mean by standards. I mean, if, as many people think, there are hermetically sealed different standards from community to community, why is it that you or I could go into a museum and look at a work of art from a culture immensely separated from us in space and time and, cultural assumptions, such as, for instance, a bronze pot from the Chu dynasty, and find it absolutely radiant with meaning and beauty. My view is that the idea of differing aesthetic standards from community to community is one which has been tremendously inflated in America and rather badly argued. In point of fact, there is absolutely no reason on earth that I can think of why, for instance, a white reader wouldn't be able to get the point of reading Langston Hughes, or why a black onlooker wouldn't be able to get into the work of Piero della Francesca just as much as a white one. There is I think there is a great deal of cant, involved in the inflation of the idea of differing aesthetic community standards within, on aesthetics within America. But my point is, and I mean, I've made it before, I will make it again, it is absolutely essential that funding bodies should look and pursue their, pursue their investigation of what is out there as widely as possible. There must be no group, no person who is ineligible a priori for this kind of support.
Should the bodies be representative?
Well, I think they already are, and yes, I think they should be, yes. But again, I think it is rather difficult to, sort of formulate recipes for this. You know, obviously, you don't want monochrome or monosexual bodies determining this. You know, of course, I mean, it's a democracy. It should run across the spectrum. But on the other hand, since Americans at the moment are so fond of dividing themselves into micro-constituencies and then claiming that each of these micro-constituencies represents a separate culture, which very often they really don't, there is a severe danger that that whole process can bog down and become just vociferous and meaningless. But in the broader, on the broader spectra, yes, I think it would be ridiculous, for instance, to sort of have some kind of a requirement that each review panel should contain so many gays and so many straights. But on the much larger divisions, men, women, blacks, whites, Hispanics, whatever, yes, I think there's a very strong case to be made for that. And in practice, it works out that way. Yes?
Caroline Goldsmith from New York. Do you believe that there should be a cabinet-level post, a Minister of Culture in the United States?
No, I do not. No, I think it would be a dreadful idea. Think of what you'd get. I mean, the only Minister of Culture that any of us can imagine would be ourselves, you know. We would all, on a certain level like to be the Ministère de la Culture, but it ain't going to happen, and if it did happen, it would be somebody who would be, sort of just, would turn into a nightmare. Don't forget that, I mean, it would become such a, the way in which the NEA became a partisan football over the last few years, I promise you would be nothing compared to the results of having a Minister of Culture in this democracy. I don't believe, you see, that actually it works out all. I don't think it's altogether consistent with the democratic spirit of America, which we foreigners so much admire. I mean, I really wouldn't want to see an American Jack Lang. And Jack Lang, in a certain sense, was the American Jack Lang. Sir.
Yes, my name is Jim. Just a person, I live outside of Boston in a sort of ordinary suburban town.
Me too.
I was wondering, the debate is not only short-term how things should be administered or how public support should be directed. The longer term, as you were mentioning, this is just it's only the last 30 years that the NEA has even existed. More the point has been for a long time whether we should have any at all.
Sorry, whether we should have any at all of what?
Public support.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think also about
it's always been a subject of very divisive debate in America whether you should have it.
Yeah, and I think about in my suburban town when public funds for schooling and education start to dry up.
Yes.
One of the first things people think that is dispensable is art classes or art space.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
It makes me wonder how much basic interest America as a culture has in art. Is that any lower than it is in other places? What's your opinion about what our fundamental basic interest is in this?
See, I think, for instance, that art classes in schools can have a very powerful educative effect. They can be terrific for the kids, and not just because, it's teaching and finger painting, but because it connects them to a whole mode of experiencing the world which they would not have otherwise. And the idea that in some way classes which expose the kids to painting, music, dance, whatever it might be, the theatre, is in some way optional, I think is very much, I think it's a tremendous pity. Looking back on my own education, which was certainly a very much more classical and rigorous, I wouldn't say anti-art, but it just ignored. It ignored the plastic arts completely, I might say. but, you know, there was, the school did put on its plays, and I learnt more from being in those plays than I probably, in the end, that was useful to me in later life than I did from, I'm sorry to say this, because I wasn't very good at ancient Greek, but possibly even more than I did from studying ancient Greek. But there is always a tendency, and it's true in Australia too, and it's true in England, you know, and as well as in America. Americans are not sort of isolated, some bunch of 260 million isolated Philistines in this regard. It's there all over the world, to regard the sphere of the arts as being in some way, some way optional. It's the icing on the cake, you know, it's the meringue, but the real cake is the sponge and, you know, nuts underneath. I believe in a much more organic and, you know, organically knit kind of conception of cultural activity than that. And I'm sorry that, you know, one of the first things to go in the small town when cuts have to be made is the supposedly less important art classes. But that is just something that, you know, one is dealing with, and it's the same all over the world in moments of shrinking educational possibility. You know, the visual literacy of Americans, you know, of many Americans compared to that of the, you know, the almost complete visual indifference of many French that I know is staggering. But, you know, it's always going to seem somehow optional, and this was one of the situations which the NEA was set up to solve. And on the whole, I think with the usual, you know, with all the admitted sort of losses and imperfections and, you know, and outright wastes of money and, you know, confusions and controversies, it has, on the whole, worked out pretty well.
My name is Ellen Barber, and I'm co-author of the National Endowment for the Arts Summer Report on the National Choreographers Study due out later this summer. In preparing the report, I've been struck by the change in funding processes. In 1965, choreographers were the first artist group funded by the endowment, and they selected 7 choreographers, including Martha Graham, Alvin Ailey, Merce Cunningham, Jose Ramon. Now, anyone who considers himself or herself to be a choreographer and has a modicum of writing ability can apply to the endowment.
Anybody who
has
considers
a modicum of writing ability, one has to be able to write.
Yes.
In order to have one's talent considered by the endowment. My question is, what do we do about the pool of artists who are either so disaffected or disinterested that they're not going to make application to any funding agency, who do have talent, who are out there? How do we find today's talent in America? Do we rely upon their ability to write the case of their art?
Yes, because if they don't approach you, how can you know about them?
And exactly, but if they can't write or don't write or won't write, how do we find them?
I don't know many artists who can't write, but I mean, I suppose such may exist. The point is not that you find them, but that they find you. I mean, the NEA is out there, everybody knows it exists, and if the artist does not wish to apply for an NEA grant, that is that artist's absolute right, as well as it is his or her right to apply. The NEA is not a missionary institution. It's one which responds to applications, as I understand it. Or perhaps you feel it should be a more missionary institution.
I feel convinced that there is talent in America which is not known, and
that is true at all times.
Artists are busy struggling to survive, to create their art, whether it's dance or music or theater. Not all of them have the time nor the expertise. They're not born with a God-given ability to write a grant application and make a persuasive argument.
Well, in that case, perhaps you should streamline and simplify the process of grant application. I'm sorry, I can suggest no other alternative.
I just wanted to know how you would force the cream to the top. You suggest we look.
You can't force the cream to the top. The cream has to float of its own molecular nature. Yes.
I'm Catherine Xu, Executive Director of Chinese Cultural Connection. The purpose of our organization is actually fulfill the needs of American majority society's needs, which is they have a tremendous need to understand the other side of the world. And we as a small group, concerned citizens, most are immigrants from China, Taiwan, or Hong Kong. We took initiative to be a self-support organization and to provide hands-on workshops coincide with school education, mostly elementary school, middle school, and high school. My question is, as a national federal support organization, how do you support initiative, diversified organization like us? So far, I myself and several board members have called upon national endowments for arts.
With any success?
I'm very sorry to say that no success.
I'm sorry.
They have suggested us to provide programs for scholars, for professors, for their study groups. However, the funding, federal funding doesn't go to the common elementary, high schools level. I'm very puzzled.
You see, unfortunately, I can't help you because I do not know anything. You know, I'm a journalist and I've never applied for a grant in my life, and so I don't know what the procedures for application to, foundations.
They say they don't have a category to fit to our needs.
Well, in that case,
I mean,
wouldn't it possibly fall under the purview of the National Endowment for the Humanities? I just don't know. I'm sorry. I can't. All the best will in the world. I can't answer the question.
I'm glad you say you don't know, because that's the main reason I myself and my colleagues come to this convention. Hopefully we have better understanding.
Yeah. I think probably, if you were to ask somebody who is, who actually works within the NEA and works within funding organisations, you might very well get an answer to that question. But I myself cannot supply it.
This is the last one.
Okay, this is the last one, sir.
My name is George Bennett, and I'm a student in Boston here. I have a question. You pointed out that the relative value of NEA funding in the 70s was higher than it has been any time since.
Well, the actual value of dollar, what you get for your dollar,
exactly. It's my understanding that during the 70s, the NEA funded relatively safe forms of art like symphonies and dance companies. I'm wondering if you feel that the controversy that exists now is necessarily all political, or whether it may possibly be an inevitable result of the more challenging work that the NEA has funded in the last few years.
Well, I think that certainly the NEA has come under fire because obviously it's come under fire because some of the material that it's funded has been found morally offensive by others. That we take for granted. And I think that, if you were to look through as it were, the funding annals of the NEA, you would find that only a small number of grants, and most of those, in fact, in the 1980s rather than the 70s, caused any kind of kerfuffle at all. It does not need, you see, I have to say that I'm rather opposed to this conventionalized language of saying that things like symphony concerts and dance and so on and so forth are safe culture. I mean, I don't know, first of all, whether we, what sort of value we're supposed to attach relatively to safe and unsafe culture. I mean, it seems to me that the performance of, say, a piece of music by Hindemith or Mozart or whoever is not, the results of it are not to be classified in terms of either safety or unsafety, but rather in terms of the, the sort of aesthetic pleasure and enlightenment that the audience might get from them. I mean, the idea that that the NEA has to be strung out between works of art which are, well, nobody uses the word avant-garde anymore, but cutting edge, and those which are not, and that it should be supporting cutting-edge stuff and shouldn't be supporting the other. I think basically that's hokum. I think, you know, because value does not rise from anywhere else except deep inside the work of art. It doesn't rise from primarily from, you know, its supposed power of social contestation, although that may have something to do with it. It isn't the mandate of the NEA to constantly fund works of art which will notionally at all points challenge the status quo. The status quo in America is enormously tolerant. The status quo is, you know, sort of, if you're talking about taste, includes just about everything and its opposite. It is a big rubber wall which it is really hard to make a permanent dent in, because America's institutional culture for the last 70 years has been nothing other than the new. Therefore, you know, this is why I, you know, keep, you know, saying that, you know, what the NEA ought to be going for is, you know, art which is, you know, sort of trying to encourage works of art rather upon the guesses it can make about their aesthetic quality than their capacity for social contestation. Now, you can have very good works of art, you can have great works of art that are socially challenging. Of course you can, always have had. But the idea that the NEA should be looking out specifically for works of art which are, for instance, political rather than non-political, I think is something of a distortion of its mission. If the no, I'm not going to get off on this because I've said it before. Yeah, go on, sorry. Well, I think the NEA was poleaxed by what went on in the late 80s. It wasn't expecting it. It didn't know how to deal with it. And it proved remarkably inept at responding to it. And of course, you know, there was a sense of disorientation and loss of direction and loss of mission. This, I think, you know, combined with the fact that, you know, the man who was running it at the time, Frohnmeyer, was not the captain one had wanted to have on the ship when the typhoon hit. Sure, I mean, the NEA's got a lot of ground to make up. I mean, the NEA's got to go back to being a pretty tough organisation, otherwise it's going to go down.
The name is Harold Towers. I'm a sculptor. Would you be interested in heading up the NEA?
No. Here I am, late in middle age, not a citizen. I mean, do you think that I want to spend the rest of my life butting horns with this bunch of dinosaurs and madmen in
I meant it as a sort of joke.
Yeah, right. You know, listen, this is a you know, this is a job which nobody in his right mind, you know, who wants to write or paint or do anything himself or would want to do.
You're going to need a tough cookie.
You need a tough cookie.
To have anybody.
I say, yeah, I mean, the person that you know, my candidate for the NEA would be John Bradamus, but he can't do it. He doesn't want to do it. I mean, I would really like to see, you know, I mean, Bradamus would be superb in that job. But it's a very tough job, and the rewards for it are not actually very high. You know, it's the old problem. You create one ingrate and 20 malcontents. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, man. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I dare say that not all of our panelists would have agreed with everything that was said tonight, and I did resist the urge, a sort of professorial urge, to call on them and say, Mr. Hansel, what do you think of that?
Mañana.
But you will hear tomorrow if you come. I hope you will all be there. And it does begin at 9:15. I look forward to seeing you. Thank you, and thank you, Robert Hughes.
Thank you.